Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek. Chapter 25. Let's review one more time the personal ending chart and then the master verb chart as we know it to date. Primary endings go on unaugmented forms, that is, the present, the future, and the perfect. Secondary endings are used on augmented forms, the imperfect and aorist. Active and middle passive are both evident in the charts supplied. Please note contractions that occur with the second person singular in the middle passives. It is best to have this chart, at least the colored part of it, perfectly memorized. Primaries: nothing sigma iota, men te nsi. Primary middle passives: mai sai tai, methys the ntai. Secondary actives: nu sigma nothing, men te nun, or san. Secondary middle passives: main sa ta, methys the nta. In our last discussion, we added the first and second future passive to our master verb chart, part 1. Please recall the tense formative of the future passive: theta eta sigma for the first future, eta sigma for the second future passive. Also remember that these future passive forms are formed on aorist passive stems, that is, the sixth principal part without its augment or tense formative or ending. With master verb chart part 2, please recall the additions from our last lesson: the first aorist passive, the tense formative of which is theta eta, and the second aorist passive, the tense formative of which is eta only. These aorist passives both, for some unusual reason, use secondary active endings. The passive is conveyed by the theta eta or the eta itself. In this chapter, we will introduce the perfect tense by beginning with a discussion of the meaning and translation of the tense. Then we'll talk about the formation of the perfect active and perfect middle passive. We'll look at some examples of these forms, both from the chart and from other forms, as an introduction to a discussion of the process of reduplication, how perfects are formed on contracts, the few second perfects that show up in the New Testament, and then finally, a variant topic, a summary of the middle voice. The meaning and translation of the perfect. The perfect tense is valued by theologians because it's often used to convey theological truths. Compressed in this tense is a lot of depth that often gets missed with a simple translation. Let's take these two sentences, which are examples of ways of translating the perfect. Your faith has saved you, a word Jesus spoke to people at times of healing. The faith has saved, that is, it did an act in the past that has an ongoing effect, namely the coming to wholeness of life that's part of healing. It stands written refers to a text that was written in the past, but still has authority. So the perfect tense, one sometimes has to throw a few words at it to get the full rich meaning of this action in the past with ongoing effect. Thus, when one runs across a perfect tense in Greek, one has to look at the broader context to determine whether to use have or has in helping words, or to shift to the present tense. The larger context will determine that. We move now to the formation of the perfect active indicative. The perfect active indicative occurs in a first form and a second form. Again, a verb will have one or the other, not both. The perfect is identified initially by the appearance of reduplication. We'll talk about reduplication more in a minute. The way to reduplicate le of our paradigm is to double the initial consonant and put an epsilon in between. That's one sign of the perfect. The tense formative for the perfect active is kappa alpha. These two pieces are added to the perfect active stem along with a primary active ending, not secondary. There's no augments here. And thus we have the form. Let's look at the full paradigm. The chart before you illustrates the formation of the perfect active indicative. The middle column, the four parts that go together, and the right column, the fully formed examples. Notice in green, the reduplication. In white, the perfect active tense stem. In yellow, the tense formative. And in blue, the primary active endings. Initially, those primary active endings are as expected. Nothing and sigma for the first and second person singulars. But in the third person singular, there is no iota, and the tense formative kappa alpha is transformed to kappa epsilon, sometimes followed by a movable nu, probably through attraction to other forms that we have seen like this. We're used to epsilon with a movable nu being a third person singular. As one continues into the plurals, the forms are as one would expect, men and te. The third person plural becomes interesting. In the standard form of the third person plural, the nc ending is added to kappa alpha, and the nu drops out, leaving the form lelikasi with a movable nu. But there is an alternate third-person plural form that also shows up where the simple ending nu is added, as in the secondary endings. Lelikon is also third-person plural, perfect indicative active. Both examples of the third-person plural are translated the same way, and some verbs will demonstrate both. Again, remember, in Hellenistic Greek, some of the nuance and careful work of classical Greek is starting to break down, and forms are drawn from one tense into another. Nonetheless, kon is rather easily recognizable as a third-person plural. The formation of the perfect middle passive. The perfect middle passive begins with reduplication, as in the perfect active. But in the case of the perfect middle passive, it is not the fourth principal part, but the fifth principal part, which provides the stem, the perfect middle passive stem. There is no tense formative and no connecting vowel, just the primary middle passive endings added directly to the stem. In the middle column of the chart, one sees the three parts: reduplication, perfect middle passive stem, and primary middle passive endings. In the second column are the forms themselves: lelimai, lelisai, lelitai, lelimatha, leliste, lelintai. Translation: I have been destroyed. Let's look at some examples of perfect active and middle passive forms with their translations. Lelike, third person singular. It has destroyed. It could also be he has destroyed or she has destroyed. Lelimetha, first person plural, perfect middle passive. We are destroyed if the emphasis is on we, or we have been destroyed, and if we have been destroyed, we still are. The third form is a gapekos. Notice this contract verb, its vowel alpha is lengthened to eta. The kappa alpha with the sigma indicates it's you singular have loved. But for reduplication, instead of a doubling of a consonant, the initial vowel is lengthened. That's called vocalic reduplication, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Gegonate is second person plural. The geg suggests it's a perfect, but notice there's not a kappa alpha, just an alpha. So this is a second perfect active. You plural have become. Apestaltai is quite interesting. The epsilon after the P looks like an augment, but it's not. Not with a tie ending. Tie is a primary ending. Since it's a primary ending, that epsilon can't be an augment, and it turns out it's a way of doing vocalic reduplication. So we have a perfect passive. She has been sent, or she is sent. Sesokasi is third person plural, perfect indicative active, nsi becoming asi when added to the kappa alpha, and notice the reduplication ses. They have saved. Eritai might throw you. This happens to be from Lego, ero, apon, a word that has three different roots. Here we're dealing with the perfect passive third person singular. It has been said. The examples just provided demonstrated various ways of doing reduplication. Let's look at how those work. The first type of reduplication is consonantal. It occurs when the first letter of the stem is a consonant. It is doubled or reduplicated and then separated from the stem with an epsilon. So if the stem is li, the initial lambda is doubled and an epsilon inserted in between le, li, yielding a form lelika. If the initial consonant, though, is a phi, a chi, or a theta, when reduplication occurs, the harder form of each of those consonants is used respectively. So phi is reduplicated to p, chi is reduplicated to kappa, and theta is reduplicated to tau. Fifth would not make much sense. Teth does. Some stems, however, begin with a vowel. If the stem begins with a vowel, vocalic reduplication occurs. That is, the lengthening of the initial vowel or diphthong, just like an augment. However, one can distinguish it from an augment because the endings are primary, not secondary. Secondaries go with augments. Primaries go with unaugmented forms or forms with reduplication. So agapao reduplicates to agapeka. Notice the lengthening of the initial alpha. Aiteo, the diphthong I reduplicates to a, so the form is ateka. The root gano gives us an interesting change because here, when one would expect consonantal reduplication, one gets vocalic. Egg no ka, not geg no ka, for the perfect of gnoska. Of note, when the verb is a compound verb consisting of a preposition and a stem, the reduplication happens to the stem following the preposition. So ekbalo in the perfect tense is ekbebleka. Notice the reduplication of the stem, not the initial preposition. Perfect tenses are formed by reduplication of the beginning of the stem. That can either be consonantal or vocalic, and on compound verbs, it's consonantal or vocalic of the stem, not the preposition. Contract verbs. In the example above, we showed a perfect of the contract verb agapao. In these two examples, agapeka and agapemai, one sees that with contracts before the kappa alpha in the perfect active or before the middle passive ending in the perfect middle passive, the contract vowel is lengthened, in this case alpha to eta. Second perfects. The translation example above also provided at least one second perfect. Second perfects form the perfect active with a tense formative that lacks the kappa. It's just an alpha. So the perfect of akuo is akekoa. The perfect of ginomai is gegona. The perfect of lambano is a leitha. Notice, in all cases, alpha only, no kappa. As we conclude this lesson on the perfect actives and middle passives, it's perhaps a good time to review the various ways in which the middle voice is used. In some cases, the middle voice is used in a way that expresses the self-interest of the actor involved. It's called the indirect middle. There is a direct object, but there is a degree of self-interest expressed by the author. And that's why the middle is used as opposed to the active. In this particular sentence, Pilate washed his hands. That washing served Pilate's interest, and so the author used the middle instead of an aorist active. A second way of translating the middle is reflexively, and in Hellenistic Greek, the reflexive pronoun also often occurs. The classic example is this clause, Judas hanged himself. The aorist middle used to indicate Judas acting upon himself. But as in most cases, a middle form is translated actively. It's a deponent. Erkomai, present middle, is translated actively. I come or go. These are the three ways in which the middle voice works: self-interest, reflexively, or as a deponent. In all cases, the translation of a middle is ultimately determined by the context. One cannot guarantee that a particular form will be translated a particular way. That's what makes the middles so rich in their possibilities. This lesson has had at its center the perfect tense, action in the past, the effect of which is ongoing to the point of the speaker, and in many cases beyond that point. We talked about the formation of the perfect active and middle, both beginning with reduplication, the perfect active having a tense formative, kappa alpha, the perfect middle passive lacking such a tense formative, but both using primary endings. After some examples, we talked in more detail about reduplication, consonantal, vocalic, and breaking up a compound verb between the preposition and the stem. We noted contracts, where the stem vowel is lengthened before the formation of the perfect. We noted a few second perfects forming the perfect without a kappa, just an alpha, and reduplication. And then this lesson ended with a discussion of the various nuances of the middle voice. That's lesson 25, and brings our study of the indicative to a conclusion. Congratulations for completing this work on the indicative mood. For those of you who are more advanced students, you might note in your textbook some advanced discussion of stems that end in a stop, perfect stems that can do some unusual things, and of the pluperfect, which is formed on the perfect stem. There aren't many in the New Testament, and so we don't teach them formally, but you may want to take a look, for they are easy to identify.